The video starts 3 seconds too late, but the silence after it is what ruined him. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about a fall, it's about the moment everything carefully built on power, wealth, and control began to collapse without warning. The frame is slightly blurred at first, the timestamp glowing in the top corner like an indifferent witness, and then it steadies just enough to show the grand staircase. White marble, polished to perfection, the kind that reflects light like water in a luxury magazine spread. At the bottom, a woman lies still, one hand protectively resting over her stomach, her breathing shallow but steady, her face pale against the cold floor. No music. No dramatic sound. Just the faint hum of a house that was too large to feel like a home. They said she slipped. That's what the official report claimed. A simple accident inside a $12 million mansion in Westchester, New York. Emily Hayes, 29, 7 months pregnant, lost her footing and fell. That's what the paramedics were told when they arrived. That's what the neighbors whispered behind closed doors. That's what her husband repeated calmly, consistently, convincingly. But the camera didn't blink. And it didn't forget. 48 hours earlier, everything looked perfect from the outside. The Hayes estate sat behind iron gates and trimmed hedges, the kind of place where everything was quiet, controlled, curated. Inside, Emily moved slowly through wide hallways, one hand always near her belly, her steps careful, measured, as if she had learned to make as little noise as possible. Staff came and went. Lights turned on before she entered rooms and off after she left. It was a life of comfort, technically. But comfort can be a strange word when silence starts to feel like pressure. Richard Hayes, self-made millionaire, real estate investor, the kind of man who was quoted in business magazines and photographed at charity galas, hadn't always been distant. There were photos once. Smiles that looked real. A hand resting gently on hers. But something had shifted months ago, subtle at first, then undeniable. Calls taken behind closed doors. Late nights that stretched into early mornings. Conversations that ended before they began. And then the numbers started to matter more than anything else. Contracts. Assets. A prenup that suddenly felt less like protection and more like a calculation. Because the truth was simple, even if no one said it out loud, the baby changed everything. Inheritance. Control. Ownership. Things that had been certain were no longer guaranteed. And in a world built on certainty, that kind of change doesn't go unnoticed. Emily noticed. Not all at once, not in a dramatic realization, but in small, quiet moments. The way Richard avoided eye contact when she mentioned the future, the way his voice flattened when she spoke about the baby's name, the way the house felt colder even when the temperature hadn't changed. Somewhere in that silence, something was decided. Not loudly. Not violently. Just decided. And the camera, mounted high in the corner of the hallway, kept recording like it always did, capturing every second without judgment, without emotion, without knowing that in less than a minute, it would hold the only version of the truth that couldn't be rewritten. Olivia Brooks had worked in large homes before, but there was something about this one that never quite settled in her chest, something she could not explain but felt every time her footsteps echoed too loudly down the hallway. So she learned to walk softer, to observe more than speak, to notice what others ignored, and that was why she saw it first, not the event itself, not yet, but the pattern that led to it. Because patterns always come before truth, always, and 2 days before the incident. She noticed how Emily stopped sitting in the main living room, how she chose the smaller sunroom instead where the windows were wide and open and the air felt less heavy, how she kept her phone close but rarely used it, how her eyes drifted toward the staircase whenever Richard entered the house as if measuring distance without knowing why, and Olivia told herself it was not her place to think too much about it because in houses like this, staff who thought too much did not last long, but even silence has a weight, and it was getting harder to carry. Richard returned that afternoon earlier than expected, his car pulling into the driveway without the usual notice, the engine cutting off sharply, the front door opening with a firmness that was not loud but final, and when he stepped inside he did not greet anyone, not the housekeeper, not Olivia. Not even Emily, who stood halfway down the hallway with one hand resting against the wall as if steadying herself. He simply looked at her, not angry, not emotional, just distant in a way that felt more dangerous than either, and Olivia felt it then, that shift in the air like the moment before a storm when everything becomes too still. Emily spoke first, her voice calm but thinner than usual, asking a simple question about dinner, about whether he would be home, about something ordinary that used to matter. And Richard answered with something even simpler, a quiet no that carried more meaning than it should have, because it was not about dinner, it was about absence, about distance, about decisions already made somewhere else. Later that evening Olivia passed by the study and heard voices, not raised, not sharp, but controlled in a way that suggested something important was being discussed without being said directly. Words like agreement, timing, and necessary change floated through the partially closed door. And then one sentence, low and steady, from Richard. The kind of sentence that does not need volume to leave an impact. You should have told me sooner. And Emily did not respond right away, which somehow said more than if she had argued, because silence, in that moment, sounded like understanding, and understanding sounded like resignation. The house remained quiet after that, too quiet, as if every room was holding its breath, and Olivia, standing in the hallway with a folded towel in her hands, glanced up at the small black camera mounted near the ceiling, the one she had checked countless times during her shifts, the one that recorded everything without ever reacting, and for the first time since she started working there, she wondered if it would one day matter not just that it recorded, but what it had seen, because something was coming, not fast, not loud, but certain, like a decision that had already been made long before anyone realized they were part of it. Morning arrived without warmth, the kind of pale gray light that filled large rooms but did nothing to soften them, and Emily was already awake long before the sun reached the tall windows, sitting at the edge of the bed with both hands resting over her stomach as if grounding herself in something real, something steady, something that could not be negotiated or rewritten, because everything else in her life now felt like it could be. And downstairs the house moved as it always did, quiet footsteps, distant clinks of dishes, controlled routines that made everything appear normal to anyone looking from the outside. But normal is often just what people agree to call something they do not want to question. Olivia noticed it again that morning, the way Emily hesitated at the top of the staircase, not afraid exactly, but aware. Like someone who understands a space differently than they used to, like the steps themselves carried meaning now, and she waited a moment longer than necessary before beginning her descent, one hand lightly tracing the railing, her movements careful but not weak, deliberate, as if each step required confirmation before it could be trusted. Richard was already in the dining room, dressed in a tailored suit that looked effortless in the way expensive things often do, reading something on his tablet without looking up. And when Emily entered he acknowledged her with a nod that felt more like a formality than recognition. She sat across from him, the distance between them filled with polished wood and silence, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because both seemed to know that whatever needed to be said would not be simple. Emily broke the silence first, her voice steady but quieter than usual, asking about the documents she had seen the night before, not accusing, not emotional, just asking, as if clarity alone might change something. Richard set the tablet down slowly, not surprised, not defensive, just prepared, and when he spoke his tone was even, controlled, the tone of someone explaining a business decision rather than addressing a life they had built together. He spoke about timing, about restructuring assets, about ensuring stability, words that sounded reasonable until you realized what they excluded, what they avoided, what they quietly replaced, and then he said it, not loudly, not sharply, but clearly. Enough that it settled into the room like something final. The baby complicates things, and for a moment even the quiet of the house seemed to pause. Emily did not react immediately, her expression did not change, but her hand moved slightly, instinctively, protectively, and when she finally spoke her voice carried something new, not fear, not anger, but certainty. A calm that comes when someone realizes the truth is no longer hidden, only unspoken. She told him she was not going anywhere, not now, not later, not because of contracts or conditions or convenience. And Richard listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his posture unchanged, but something behind his eyes shifted, something subtle but unmistakable, like a door closing quietly instead of slamming, and across the room Olivia stood near the kitchen entrance, holding a tray she no longer remembered picking up, watching without meaning to watch, listening without wanting to hear, and above them all the small camera in the corner remained still, its lens capturing the distance between two people sitting at the same table, recording a moment that looked calm, almost ordinary, but felt like the beginning of something that could not be undone. The rest of that day unfolded with a precision that felt almost rehearsed, as if both of them had silently agreed to avoid anything that might force the truth into the open too quickly, and yet the truth lingered in every space between their words, in every glance that ended too soon, in every silence that lasted just a second too long. Emily spent most of the afternoon in the sunroom again. The one place in the house that did not feel entirely controlled, the light softer there, the air easier to breathe. But even that space could not fully shield her from the growing awareness settling inside her, because once something is understood, it does not go back to being unknown, and she understood now that this was no longer about distance or misunderstanding. It was about intention, about decisions being made without her, around her, and possibly against her. Upstairs Richard moved through his office with the same calm efficiency he used in business meetings, phone calls placed in low tones, numbers discussed, timelines adjusted, his voice never rising, never breaking, the voice of a man who believed control was something that could be maintained as long as it was never questioned, and perhaps that was why he underestimated the quiet. Because quiet does not mean unaware. Olivia noticed how the staff adjusted around them that day, conversations shortened, footsteps softened even further. As if everyone could feel that something had shifted but no one wanted to be the one to acknowledge it, because in houses like this acknowledgement could be more dangerous than ignorance. Late in the afternoon a visitor arrived, her heels clicking against the stone entryway with a confidence that did not belong to someone unfamiliar with the house. Vanessa Cole did not need to introduce herself, not to Olivia, not to the housekeeper, and certainly not to Richard, who greeted her with a familiarity that confirmed everything Emily had already begun to suspect. But what stood out was not the presence of the visitor, it was the absence of hesitation. The way everything about the interaction felt expected, like a continuation. Rather than an interruption, Emily saw her from the hallway, not hiding, not confronting, simply observing, her expression composed in a way that required effort, because sometimes strength is not loud, sometimes it is the decision to remain still when everything inside you is telling you to react. Vanessa's voice carried lightly through the space, casual, almost amused, speaking about plans, about upcoming events, about timing in a way that echoed the same words Richard had used earlier, and that repetition mattered because repetition is rarely accidental, it is usually a sign of alignment, and alignment meant this was not new, this was not sudden, this had been unfolding for longer than Emily had realized. For a moment their eyes met across the room, Emily and Vanessa, and in that brief exchange there was no hostility, no dramatic confrontation, just recognition. The kind that does not need words to confirm what is already clear. Later, as evening approached and the house began to dim into shadows and soft lighting, Emily found herself once again at the base of the staircase, looking up at the long stretch of marble steps that curved upward toward the second floor, and something about it felt different now, not physically, not visibly, but in the way it held meaning, in the way it represented more than just a path between levels, because sometimes places become symbols without anyone intending them to. And as she stood there, one hand resting gently over her stomach, the other lightly touching the railing, the camera above remained still, its quiet presence unchanged, capturing a moment that seemed ordinary to anyone who might later watch it. But for Emily, for Olivia, for anyone who had begun to notice the patterns, it no longer felt ordinary at all. It felt like a point on a line that had been moving steadily towards something inevitable, something that had not happened yet, but was already, in its own quiet way, beginning. Evening settled over the mansion with a quiet that felt heavier than before, the kind that made every sound more noticeable, every movement more deliberate, and Emily remained near the staircase longer than she realized, her gaze following the curve of the railing upward as if tracing a path she was not yet sure she wanted to take. because sometimes the simplest actions carry the most weight when everything else has changed. Behind her, the low murmur of voices drifted from the living room where Richard and Vanessa continued their conversation, their tones relaxed, controlled, almost casual, as if nothing in the house had shifted at all, as if the presence of another person in what was supposed to be a shared life required no explanation, and that absence of explanation said more than any confession could have. Olivia moved quietly between rooms, performing tasks that no longer required her full attention, because her focus kept returning to the same place, the same tension that seemed to gather around Emily without ever being acknowledged. And when Emily finally turned toward the stairs, it was not rushed, not emotional, just a decision made in stillness, one step forward, then another, her hand resting lightly along the cool surface of the railing, grounding herself in something solid, something predictable, something that did not shift without warning. The house remained quiet except for the soft echo of her footsteps against marble, a sound that carried further than expected in a space that large, and above her the camera continued its silent observation, unchanged, unwavering, capturing angles and movements that meant nothing in isolation but everything when placed together. Halfway up the staircase, Emily paused, not because she had lost balance or direction, but because something inside her seemed to register the moment as important. As if time itself had slowed just enough for her to feel it, to recognize that whatever came next would not be undone by anything that followed. Downstairs, Richard's voice lowered, a subtle shift that suggested awareness, not of what was happening, but of what might happen, because control often comes with a heightened sensitivity to disruption, and he stepped into the hallway, his footsteps measured, his expression composed, the same expression he carried into negotiations and meetings, the same expression that never revealed more than it intended to. He looked up toward Emily, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. The distance between them filled not with anger or accusation, but with something quieter and more final, understanding without agreement, awareness without resolution. Emily's voice broke the silence, calm, steady, asking a question that sounded simple but carried everything beneath it, whether any of this still mattered to him. And Richard did not answer immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because he was choosing which version of it to give, and in that pause the truth existed fully, unfiltered, before it could be reshaped into something easier to accept. Olivia stood just out of sight, her breath held without realizing it, her attention fixed on the space between them, on the moment that seemed to stretch longer than it should, and above them the camera recorded every second, every glance, every silence, storing it without judgment, without interpretation, just data waiting for meaning. And then Richard spoke, his tone even, controlled, stating that some things were already decided, that certain outcomes were unavoidable, words that sounded like conclusions rather than conversation, and Emily listened without interruption, her hand tightening slightly against the railing, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because in that moment she understood something clearly for the first time. That this was no longer a discussion about the future, it was the result of a decision that had already been made, and the house, with all its space and silence, seemed to close in around that realization, holding it in place as the moment quietly moved toward what came next. The air between them did not break, it tightened, like something invisible pulling just enough to remind both of them that this moment was no longer reversible, and Emily took one more step upward, not to leave, not to escape, but to create space, the kind of space people instinctively reach for when they realize they are no longer safe inside a conversation, her hand still resting along the railing, her movements controlled, deliberate, while Richard moved closer to the base of the staircase. Not rushing, not reacting, simply adjusting position as if proximity itself was a form of control, and when he spoke again his voice remained calm, almost detached, explaining rather than arguing, saying that everything had been planned with precision, that there was no need for resistance, that outcomes were already aligned in ways she did not fully understand. And that was when Emily exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in clarity, because sometimes the final piece is not loud, it is quiet, it is the moment when confusion disappears and what remains is undeniable. She told him, without raising her voice, that she did understand, that she understood more than he thought. That this was never about protection or stability, that it was about control, about removing uncertainty, about making sure nothing unexpected could alter what he had built, and for the first time something flickered across Richard's expression, not anger, not regret, but irritation, subtle and brief, the kind that appears when a narrative is challenged before it can fully settle. Downstairs the lights reflected softly against polished surfaces, the house still, almost unnaturally so. As if even the walls were aware that something significant was unfolding, Olivia remained just beyond the edge of the hallway, her presence hidden but her attention fixed, every instinct telling her that this was no longer something to ignore, because there are moments when observation becomes responsibility, even if you do not yet know what you will do with what you see. Emily shifted her weight slightly, her balance steady, her gaze fixed on Richard as she spoke again, asking him one final question, not emotional, not pleading, just direct, whether any part of him had considered what this would mean beyond numbers and outcomes, beyond contracts and timing, and Richard did not answer immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to reveal that the question itself did not fit into the framework he had constructed, and when he finally responded it was with the same measured tone, stating that some sacrifices were necessary, that certain variables had to be managed, words that sounded clinical, detached from the reality they described, and that was when Emily nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because the truth no longer required explanation, it simply existed, clear and immovable, and in that moment the distance between them was no longer physical, it was absolute. Above them the camera continued its silent recording, capturing the stillness, the positioning, the final exchange of words that marked the end of something that had once appeared unbreakable. And as the seconds passed, unnoticed by anyone except the device that never looked away, the moment reached its quiet edge, the point where conversation ends and consequence begins, not with noise, not with chaos, but with a shift so small it could be missed, and yet so final it would change everything that followed. It happened in a way that almost no one would notice if they were not looking directly at it, not a dramatic movement, not something loud or chaotic, just a subtle shift in balance, a moment where intention and action blurred into something irreversible. Emily's hand tightened slightly on the railing as her body adjusted, not reacting to fear but to awareness. Because there is a difference between losing control and recognizing it is about to be taken, and in that fraction of time, everything slowed, the kind of stillness that only exists in moments that matter. Richard stood just below, his posture unchanged, his expression composed, but there was something in the way he stepped forward, something deliberate in the timing, not rushed, not accidental, simply aligned with everything that had been said and everything that had not. Olivia saw it from where she stood, not clearly, not perfectly, but enough to understand that what followed was not a misunderstanding, not a misstep, but the continuation of something already decided. The air seemed to drop in temperature, the silence breaking not with noise but with absence, and then Emily was no longer standing where she had been, the space she occupied a second before now empty, the movement too fast to process in real time, too quiet to register as anything but wrong. Olivia's breath caught as her mind struggled to catch up, to make sense of what she had just seen. Because the human brain searches for normal explanations, even when none exist. Downstairs Richard moved immediately, not in panic, not in confusion, but with a controlled urgency that felt practiced, his voice calling out in a tone that suggested surprise, concern, the appropriate response for the situation he was now presenting, and within seconds the house that had been so silent filled with movement, footsteps, voices, the sound of a call being made, instructions given. Everything unfolding exactly as it would in an emergency, except for one thing. The camera above had already captured the moment before the narrative could be shaped, the second before the call, the position before the explanation, and that difference, that small gap between reality and story, was everything. Emily lay at the bottom of the staircase, her breathing shallow but present, her hand still near her stomach as if instinct alone had guided it there, and even in that moment there was no chaos in her expression, only a distant awareness, as if her mind had not yet fully caught up to what her body had experienced. Olivia moved forward finally, her hesitation breaking as instinct took over, kneeling beside Emily, her voice soft but urgent, asking if she could hear her, if she was okay, if she could respond. Questions that filled the space but did not change the fact that something irreversible had just occurred. Richard stood nearby, his tone steady as he spoke into the phone, describing what had happened, choosing words carefully, constructing a version of events that sounded clean, simple, acceptable, and as he spoke his eyes flicked once, just once, toward the camera. A glance so brief it could have been nothing, except it was not nothing. Because in that glance was awareness, and awareness meant he understood that the truth did not belong entirely to him anymore. Above them the small black lens remained fixed, silent, unblinking, holding within it the one version of the moment that could not be adjusted, could not be reworded, could not be explained away, and as the sound of distant sirens began to approach, faint at first, then growing louder with each passing second, the house stood still around them, its polished surfaces reflecting a reality that was already beginning to split into two versions, the one being told, and the one that had actually happened, and only one of them had been recorded in full. The sirens grew louder with each passing second, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the mansion, and for the first time since it happened, time seemed to move forward again instead of stretching endlessly in place. Olivia stayed beside Emily, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest, repeating simple reassurances, telling her to stay still, to keep breathing, to focus on the sound of her voice. Because sometimes words are the only thing you can offer when everything else is uncertain. Emily's eyes fluttered slightly, not fully open, not fully aware, but present enough to respond in the smallest ways, a faint movement, a shallow breath, enough to confirm she was still there, still holding on, and that mattered more than anything else in that moment. Richard ended the call just as the sound of tires approached the driveway, his posture straightening, his expression shifting seamlessly into something appropriate, concern measured and controlled, the kind that would be expected from a husband in a situation like this. And when the front doors opened and paramedics rushed in, everything became efficient, structured, professional. Questions asked in quick succession, answers given just as quickly, Richard explaining again that she had slipped, that it happened suddenly, that he had been right there but could not reach her in time, his voice consistent, unwavering, the same version repeated without hesitation, because consistency makes a story easier to believe, and belief is often built on repetition. Olivia stepped back slightly to give the paramedics space. But her eyes did not leave Emily, not even for a second, as they checked her condition, speaking in calm, practiced tones, noting her responsiveness, stabilizing her carefully, preparing to move her without causing further harm, and through all of it, the house remained exactly as it had been before, the same polished surfaces, the same quiet lighting, the same stillness, as if nothing had changed, as if the walls themselves refused to acknowledge what had just taken place inside them. Vanessa stood near the doorway now, her expression composed but distant, watching without stepping forward, without speaking, her presence quiet but noticeable, and in that stillness there was no urgency, no visible concern, just observation, as if she were witnessing something inevitable rather than unexpected. The stretcher was brought in, movements coordinated, careful, Emily lifted with precision, every motion controlled to protect her and the life she carried. And as they carried her toward the door, Olivia followed instinctively for a few steps before stopping, her role ending at the threshold, her responsibility shifting from action to memory, because what she had seen did not leave when the ambulance doors closed. It stayed clear and sharp in her mind, louder than anything that had been said aloud. Behind her Richard remained inside, speaking briefly with one of the responders, answering final questions, maintaining the same calm narrative, the same carefully chosen words. But when the doors finally closed and the sound of the ambulance began to fade into the distance, the house returned to silence again. A silence that no longer felt neutral, no longer felt empty, but heavy with something unspoken, and slowly, almost without realizing why, Olivia looked up toward the corner of the hallway where the small camera remained fixed in place, its dark lens reflecting nothing, giving nothing away, and yet holding within it something that could not be ignored, something that existed beyond memory, beyond interpretation. Something exact, unchanging, and for the first time since she started working there. Olivia understood that what had been recorded was not just a moment, it was the difference between what would be said and what could be proven, and that difference was about to matter more than anyone inside that house was ready for. The hospital lights were too bright, the kind that made everything feel sharper than it should, and Emily lay beneath them surrounded by quiet urgency, machines humming softly, monitors tracing rhythms that mattered more than anything else in that room, doctors and nurses moving with calm precision, their voices steady, controlled, focused on what could still be preserved rather than what had already been lost. And somewhere in that controlled environment, reality existed without narrative. Without interpretation, just facts measured in numbers, in responses, in the fragile balance between stability and risk. Hours passed in a way that felt both fast and endless, and when Emily finally regained full awareness, the first thing she noticed was not the room, not the voices, but the absence of the house, the silence of it replaced by something clinical, something real. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. A quiet check, a question without words, and when a nurse noticed the movement she responded gently, reassuring her that she was being monitored closely, that everything was being done, that she needed to rest. Simple words, but enough to anchor her in the present. Back at the mansion the silence had returned completely, deeper now, heavier, no longer the quiet of routine but the quiet of something that had happened and could not be undone. Richard moved through the house with the same controlled pace. Phone calls made, statements given, details repeated with careful consistency, each word chosen to align with the version he had already established, and outside of that narrative, nothing else was acknowledged, because control depends on limiting what is allowed to exist. Olivia remained in the hallway long after the ambulance had gone, her thoughts circling the same moment over and over, not because she wanted to relive it, but because her mind was trying to understand it, to reconcile what she had seen with what she had heard, and those two things did not match, not completely, not in a way that could be ignored. Slowly, almost without deciding to, she walked toward the small control panel near the kitchen. The one connected to the house security system, something she had used before only for routine checks, never for anything that felt important. Her hand hesitated for a second before pressing the button that brought up the recorded footage. The screen flickered to life, the timeline stretching across the bottom. Ordinary moments captured in sequence, empty hallways, quiet rooms, nothing out of place, until she moved it forward, her fingers sliding along the bar, stopping just before the time she knew mattered. And for a moment she paused, not because she was unsure, but because she understood that once she saw it clearly, there would be no going back to uncertainty. She pressed play, the image appearing exactly as it had been, the staircase, the lighting, the stillness, Emily standing where Olivia remembered, Richard below, the distance between them visible and measurable, and then the moment unfolded again, not faster, not slower, just exact, the positioning, the movement, the timing. Everything aligning in a way that left no space for interpretation. Olivia's breath caught as she leaned closer to the screen, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because what she was seeing confirmed what she had felt, what she had known without fully admitting it, and as the clip ended, returning to stillness, she did not move right away, her eyes fixed on the screen as if expecting something to change, something to correct itself, but nothing did. The footage remained what it was, complete, unaltered, undeniable. And in that moment Olivia understood something that had not been clear before, that this was no longer just something she had witnessed, it was something she now held, something that existed beyond memory, beyond doubt, something that could not be reshaped by words. And as she stood there in the quiet kitchen, the soft glow of the screen fading, the house around her unchanged yet entirely different, the weight of that realization settled in, steady and unavoidable, because the truth had been recorded, and sooner or later, it would have to be faced. By the next morning, the version of events had already begun to settle into place outside the hospital walls, clean and simple, repeated in quiet conversations and official notes. A fall, an accident, an unfortunate moment inside a large home where no one could have predicted what happened, and the more it was said, the more it started to sound real, because repetition has a way of smoothing out doubt, of replacing questions with acceptance. And inside the hospital room, Emily listened as fragments of that version reached her, not directly, not as a statement, but through the careful language of doctors, the cautious tone of staff who knew only what they had been told, and she did not interrupt, did not correct them, because she understood something they did not, that truth does not always disappear when it is replaced. Sometimes it waits, quiet and unchanged, until the moment it is needed. Back at the mansion, Richard sat in his office, the door closed, the space around him controlled and silent, his phone resting on the desk as messages came in, calls from associates, from legal advisors, from people who spoke in careful terms about managing situations, about protecting interests, about ensuring that everything remained aligned, and Richard responded the same way he always did, calm, precise, focused, because to him this was no different than any other problem that required resolution. It was simply a matter of maintaining the right narrative, of ensuring that no conflicting version gained traction, and for a while, that control held, because most people only see what they are shown. Olivia did not sleep that night, the footage replaying in her mind even when her eyes were closed, not as a blur, not as something uncertain, but clear, exact, every detail fixed in place, and by morning she knew that doing nothing was no longer an option, not because she wanted to act, but because inaction now felt like a decision she could not justify. She returned to the control panel, her movements slower this time, more deliberate, as if each step carried weight, and she accessed the system again, navigating to the recording, her fingers steady despite the tension in her chest. She copied the file onto a small drive, watching the progress bar move forward, each percentage bringing the truth out of the system and into something she could hold, something that could not be erased as easily as a narrative could be repeated. When it finished, she removed the drive carefully, holding it for a moment as if confirming it was real, that what she had seen was now something tangible, something that existed beyond memory. And as she stood there in the quiet kitchen, the early morning light filtering through the windows, she understood that this was no longer about what had happened, it was about what would be done with it. Later that day, Richard made another call, this one quieter, more measured, speaking to someone whose role was not to ask questions but to manage outcomes, his voice low, his words chosen with precision, ensuring that everything remained consistent, that no unnecessary attention was drawn, that the situation remained contained, and as he spoke, he believed that control was still intact, that the version he had established would hold, because, from his perspective, there was nothing else, nothing beyond what he had said, nothing that could challenge it, and in that belief, he remained composed, unaware that elsewhere, outside his carefully constructed narrative, the truth had already begun to move, not loudly, not publicly, but quietly, in the hands of someone who had seen everything and could no longer pretend she had not. Olivia did not tell anyone at first, not because she doubted what she had seen, but because she understood how fragile truth can be when it stands alone against something carefully constructed, and she needed to be certain that when she stepped forward, it would not be dismissed, not explained away, not reduced to misunderstanding, so she chose her next move with the same caution she had used when pressing play on the footage. Deliberate, measured, aware that once she acted, there would be no returning to the quiet safety of observation. She left the mansion that afternoon under the pretense of a routine errand, the small drive secured in her bag, its presence heavier than its size suggested, and she drove farther than she normally would, past familiar streets, past places that felt too close to what she was leaving behind, until she reached an office building where anonymity felt possible, where decisions could be made without immediate consequence. Inside, the reception area was calm, neutral, the kind of place where people came with problems they could no longer manage alone, and when she introduced herself, her voice steady despite everything, she did not explain everything at once. She simply said that she had something that needed to be reviewed, something important, something that could not be ignored, and within minutes she was seated across from Daniel Reed, an attorney whose reputation was built on cases where truth and narrative did not align, his presence calm, attentive, not rushing her, not interrupting, allowing the silence to settle until she was ready to fill it. Olivia placed the drive on the desk between them, a simple object holding something far from simple, and for a moment neither of them moved, because both understood that whatever was on it would define what came next. Daniel reached for it carefully, connecting it to his computer, his expression unchanged as the file loaded. The screen flickering to life with the same hallway, the same staircase, the same stillness that Olivia had watched the night before, and as the footage played, the room remained silent, not because there was nothing to say, but because what they were seeing did not require commentary, it required acknowledgement, and when it ended, Daniel did not react immediately, he did not rush to conclusions or speak in absolutes, instead he leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from the screen to Olivia. Measuring not just the footage, but the weight of what it represented, he asked her a single question, whether this was the original recording, whether it had been altered in any way, and Olivia answered without hesitation, because certainty was the only thing she had left to rely on. No, it was exactly as it had been captured, and that answer mattered, because authenticity is what turns suspicion into evidence. Daniel nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried significance. And then he spoke, not with urgency, not with emotion, but with clarity, explaining that what she had brought him was not just a recording, it was a contradiction, a direct conflict with the version of events that had already begun to circulate, and conflicts like that do not stay hidden for long, they surface, they demand resolution, and when they do, they change everything. Olivia listened, her hands still, her breathing steady, absorbing the reality of what she had set in motion, because this was no longer about what she had seen, it was about what would happen next, and somewhere else, across town, in a quiet office where everything still appeared controlled, Richard Hayes continued his day as if nothing had shifted, unaware that the version he had repeated with such precision was no longer the only one that existed. Unaware that the truth had already found its way into the hands of someone who knew exactly what to do with it, and that quiet shift, unseen, unacknowledged, was already beginning to dismantle everything he believed was still under control. By the time the legal process began, the story had already taken shape in two completely different directions, one version repeated in statements and reports, clean and controlled, the other sitting quietly on a file that had not yet been seen by the people who believed they already understood everything. And when those two versions finally met, it did not happen loudly, it happened in a courtroom where silence carried more weight than noise, where every word was measured and every pause meant something. Emily was present, seated carefully, her posture composed, her expression calm in a way that came not from ease but from clarity, because she no longer needed to question what had happened, she only needed to allow it to be shown. Across the room Richard maintained the same controlled demeanor he had carried from the beginning, his confidence intact, his narrative consistent, supported by statements that aligned with everything he had said before, and for a moment it seemed as if that version would hold, because confidence can be persuasive when it is uninterrupted. Daniel Reed stood when it was time, his movements steady, his tone calm, not dramatic, not confrontational, simply precise, and he began by outlining the established version of events, repeating it exactly as it had been presented, not to reinforce it, but to define it clearly before introducing what would challenge it, and then, without raising his voice, without shifting his tone, he requested that the court review a piece of evidence that had not yet been considered, something recorded, something original, something that had not been altered or interpreted. The room shifted slightly at that moment, not visibly, but in attention, because evidence changes the way people listen. The screen was brought into view, the file loaded, the same hallway, the same staircase appearing again. But this time it was not being watched in private, it was being watched in a space where truth carried consequences, and as the footage played, the room remained completely still, no interruptions, no reactions, just the quiet unfolding of a moment that could not be reshaped, the positioning, the timing, the movement, all of it visible in a way that required no explanation. And when it ended, the silence that followed was different from before. It was not empty, it was full of understanding, full of realization, full of the shift that happens when certainty changes direction. Richard's expression did not break immediately, but something in his posture changed, something small but noticeable, the kind of change that happens when control begins to slip, not suddenly, but inevitably. The narrative he had repeated no longer stood alone, it had been met, directly, clearly, with something that could not be dismissed, and in that moment, everything he had built around that version began to weaken, not because someone argued against it, but because the truth had been shown beside it, and the difference was impossible to ignore. Emily did not speak, she did not need to, her presence alone, steady and composed, was enough, because this was no longer about convincing anyone, it was about allowing what had already happened to be seen without distortion, and as the proceedings continued, as voices resumed and the formal process moved forward, the outcome had already begun to take shape in the quiet understanding that filled the room, because sometimes justice does not arrive with force, it arrives with clarity, and once that clarity exists, it cannot be undone. In the days that followed, nothing returned to what it had been, not the house, not the silence, not the carefully constructed sense of control that had once defined every corner of that life, because once truth is seen clearly it does not fade back into uncertainty, it stays steady and undeniable. And Emily no longer walked through spaces as someone unsure of her place within them, she moved with a quiet certainty, not loud, not dramatic, but grounded in something that could not be taken from her again. The legal process continued with its measured pace, decisions formalized, consequences outlined in language that was precise and final, and Richard, who had once operated within a world where outcomes could be shaped through influence and control, now found himself in a space where clarity outweighed narrative, where evidence did not bend to intention, his presence diminished not through spectacle, but through the simple fact that what had been shown could not be undone, and that was enough. Olivia returned to her routine, but nothing felt routine anymore, because she understood now that even the smallest actions can carry weight far beyond their moment. That choosing to act, even quietly, can shift the direction of something much larger than yourself. She did not speak publicly, did not seek recognition. Her role had never been about being seen, it had been about ensuring that what was true did not remain hidden, and that was enough for her. The mansion itself remained standing, unchanged in structure, its polished floors and wide staircases reflecting the same light they always had, but spaces remember, even when people pretend they do not, and there are places within it that will always hold what happened, not visibly, not in a way that can be pointed to, but in a way that exists beneath the surface, in the quiet awareness that something real once occurred there and was not allowed to disappear. Emily stood outside one afternoon, the air cooler, the sky open in a way that felt different from before, her hand resting lightly over her stomach, not out of fear, but out of connection, a reminder of what had been protected, what had endured, and she did not look back at the house for long. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she no longer needed to face it. Some chapters do not require revisiting once they have been fully understood, and as she turned away, stepping forward into something not yet defined but no longer uncertain, the weight she carried was no longer confusion or doubt, it was clarity, and clarity, once earned, does not leave, because in the end, it was never about the moment itself. Not the silence, not the fall, not even the recording, it was about what remained after everything else had been stripped away, and what remained was simple, steady, and impossible to ignore. Some people spend their lives building control, believing it will protect them from consequence. But control is fragile when it depends on silence, and silence has a way of breaking at the exact moment it matters most, because in a world where everything can be managed, shaped, and rewritten, the one thing that cannot be negotiated is the truth, and once it is seen, it does not need to fight to be heard, it only needs to exist.